Olivia Carter woke before sunrise, as she had nearly every day since taking her seat on the state Supreme Court. Today, however, was different. There was an electric current in the air, a sense of gravity she couldn't ignore. It wasn't the kind of day where she could afford to be distracted or lose focus. Olivia had fought for years to earn her place on the bench, overcoming obstacles that would have deterred most. And this morning she felt the weight of all those battles. Her penthouse apartment, with its expansive windows offering a panoramic view of the city skyline, was a testament to her hard-earned success. The room was filled with early morning light, casting a golden hue across the modern furnishings and shelves of legal books that had been her companions for as long as she could remember. Standing before the mirror in her bedroom, Olivia adjusted her tailored navy blue suit. It was elegant, yet powerful, reflecting the image she had cultivated. Professional, composed, unyielding. She allowed herself a moment of quiet reflection, smoothing her hair into a sleek chignon. Her fingers paused, tracing the faint lines near her eyes. She had earned those too, through long nights spent poring over case files, the relentless pursuit of justice that had driven her every move. Olivia was no stranger to hard work. In fact, she thrived on it. Her journey had been steeped in challenges, not only as a woman in a male-dominated field, but as a black woman navigating the deeply ingrained biases that shadowed her every step. The apartment was quiet, save for the distant hum of traffic far below. She took a deep breath, centering herself before the day ahead. Her assistant, Ethan, was already on his way over. He was young, smart, and fiercely loyal, always 2 steps ahead when it came to managing her day. Olivia trusted him implicitly, but there was still an edge of anticipation that made her feel slightly on edge today. Her phone buzzed softly on the marble countertop, and she picked it up to see a message from her mother. "Good luck today, my love. I'm so proud of you always. Remember who you are. Love, Mom." Olivia smiled softly. Her mother had been her greatest supporter from day one, and though they didn't always see eye to eye, especially when it came to Olivia's workload and how little time she had for herself, there was no denying the strength of their bond. Her mother's quiet resilience was the foundation upon which Olivia had built her own strength. Ethan arrived right on schedule, his usual brisk, efficient self. He handed her a folder containing the briefs for her court session and quickly went over the day's itinerary. "Everything's lined up, Judge Carter," he said with a grin. "You've got this." "Thanks, Ethan," Olivia replied, her eyes scanning the papers one last time before she slipped them into her briefcase. "Let's make sure everything runs smoothly." As she stepped out of her apartment and into the sleek black sedan waiting for her, Olivia couldn't help but feel a sense of triumph rising within her. Today was more than just another day in court. It was a culmination of years of perseverance, of silencing doubters and proving that she belonged. And yet, as the car began its journey through the winding streets of the city, a familiar feeling of apprehension settled in the pit of her stomach. Olivia was no stranger to being underestimated, questioned, even mistrusted, simply because of who she was and what she represented. The car glided through affluent neighborhoods, where manicured lawns and towering trees lined the streets. These were the kinds of neighborhoods where Olivia often felt the subtle but unmistakable judgment of passers-by, the quick glances that lingered too long, the eyes that followed her car with a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. She had grown used to it over the years, the constant undercurrent of, "What is she doing here?" that seemed to accompany her everywhere outside the courthouse. As they passed a large estate with sprawling gardens, Olivia caught sight of a woman walking her dog, her gaze flickering over the car before quickly looking away. It was a look Olivia had seen more times than she could count, the unspoken question of whether she truly belonged in these parts. Even in a luxury car, even as a judge, Olivia knew there were those who would never see her as more than an outsider. But today, she wouldn't let those glances get to her. She had too much to accomplish, too much riding on her work. The city was her home, and she had earned her place in it, no matter how many people still doubted her right to be there. The morning sun was fully up now, casting a bright light over the city as Olivia's car made its way toward the courthouse. She felt herself relax slightly as they neared the familiar territory of downtown, where the imposing buildings of justice and government stood like sentinels. Here she felt in control, like the powerful force of law and order she had worked so hard to become. This was her arena, and she knew exactly how to navigate it. But just as she was about to settle into the rhythm of her day, something unexpected happened. The car slowed as it approached an intersection, and then Olivia noticed the flashing lights in her rearview mirror. A police car. The driver, startled, glanced at her through the rearview mirror. "Everything all right, ma'am?" he asked. Olivia nodded, though her heart rate had quickened. "Pull over," she said calmly, keeping her voice steady. "Let's see what this is about." As the car came to a stop on the side of the road, Olivia watched the officer approach in her side mirror. He was a tall, imposing figure in his mid-30s, with sharp, angular features and a stern expression. His hand rested on the holster of his gun as he walked up to the driver's side window, which the driver rolled down obediently. "Good morning, officer," Olivia said, her voice even and polite. "Is there a problem?" The officer's gaze shifted from the driver to Olivia, and something in his expression changed when he saw her. His eyes narrowed slightly, as if recalculating the situation. He glanced at the car, then back at her, suspicion flickering across his face. "License and registration," he said flatly, not acknowledging her greeting. The driver handed over his license, but the officer's attention remained fixed on Olivia. "I'll need to see yours as well," he added, his tone carrying an edge of authority. Olivia raised an eyebrow. "I'm not driving," she said. "Is there a reason you're asking for my ID?" The officer's gaze hardened. "I need to verify ownership of this vehicle, ma'am. Please step out of the car." The request hit Olivia like a cold wave. She knew exactly what was happening, even if the officer hadn't said it outright. The car, her presence, her skin color, it all added up to a narrative she had encountered many times before. He didn't see a judge. He saw a black woman in an expensive car, and that to him was enough to warrant suspicion. "I don't think that's necessary," Olivia replied, her voice firm but controlled. "This car belongs to me, and I have every right to be here." The officer's eyes narrowed further, his posture stiffening. "Ma'am, I need you to step out of the vehicle," he repeated, his hand hovering closer to his holster now. Olivia's pulse quickened, but she refused to let her fear show. She had faced tougher adversaries in courtrooms, men with far more power than this officer, but there was something deeply unsettling about being treated as a suspect in a situation where she knew she had done nothing wrong. The injustice of it boiled beneath her composed exterior. "I'm not stepping out of this vehicle without just cause," she said, her voice low but resolute. For a moment, the two of them locked eyes, the tension between them thickening with every passing second. The officer's hand twitched, and Olivia could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on her. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about the countless others who had found themselves in similar situations, unfairly targeted and treated with suspicion simply for existing in spaces where they were not expected to be. Just then, a second car pulled up behind the police cruiser. Olivia glanced in the mirror and saw the familiar logo of a news station on the side. A reporter and cameraman stepped out, clearly intrigued by the flashing lights and stopped vehicles. This confrontation was about to become public, and the officer knew it. The presence of the news crew only added fuel to the already simmering tension. Olivia saw the officer stiffen slightly, glancing back at the approaching reporter, and for a brief moment, uncertainty flickered across his face. But it was gone as quickly as it appeared, replaced by the same steely resolve. His hand still hovered near his holster, his posture one of thinly veiled aggression. Olivia, however, remained calm, even as the fear and anger coursed through her veins. She had spent years learning how to keep her composure under the most intense scrutiny, and today she would not allow herself to falter. This man saw her as a threat, as someone who did not belong, and she would not let him or anyone else strip her of her dignity. The reporter, a young woman with sharp features and a determined expression, approached cautiously, her cameraman trailing behind her with the equipment poised. Olivia recognized her. Elena Sanchez, an investigative journalist with a reputation for covering cases of racial injustice and police misconduct. This incident, Olivia realized, would likely be the next story Elena would cover. "Ma'am, please step out of the vehicle," the officer repeated, this time with a little more force. The pressure of the cameras now recording him seemed to make him more defensive. His demand cut through the air like a blade. Olivia knew she was walking a fine line. She understood the risk of escalation if she refused again. But she also knew that stepping out of the vehicle could put her at even greater risk. A black woman being forcibly removed from a car by an officer with a hand on his weapon was an image that played through her mind all too vividly. Too many names, too many lives had been lost in situations that began just like this. She held her ground. "I'm a state Supreme Court judge. I've done nothing wrong, and I know my rights. There is no legal basis for you to order me out of this car. Unless you have probable cause, I'm staying right where I am." Her voice was strong, unyielding, and in that moment, Olivia knew that she was no longer just fighting for herself. She was standing for everyone who had ever been pulled over, questioned, or detained because of the color of their skin. She could feel the weight of that responsibility settling on her shoulders. The officer's face darkened at her refusal. His authority was being challenged, not just by Olivia, but now in front of the cameras. His hand shifted closer to his gun, and the tension reached a boiling point. He took a step toward the car, his body language radiating aggression. But just as he was about to say something, Elena Sanchez spoke up. "Officer, this is all being recorded. Is there a reason you're asking a sitting judge to step out of her car without cause?" Her voice was steady but sharp, cutting through the officer's attempted dominance with a layer of accountability that he hadn't anticipated. He shot a look at the reporter, clearly irritated by her intrusion. "This is a routine traffic stop," he said, his voice growing defensive. "I need to verify that she has the right to be driving this vehicle." "You've already received her driver's license and she has stated who she is," Elena responded, not backing down. "Is there something else you suspect her of?" The officer's jaw clenched, his frustration mounting. He had been caught in the crosshairs of public scrutiny, and now the situation was spiraling out of his control. For a moment, Olivia thought he might actually force her out of the car despite the cameras, despite the clear overreach of his authority. The weight of his pride and position warred with the reality of the situation he now found himself in. The cameraman zoomed in, capturing every second of the exchange. Olivia could see the wheels turning in the officer's mind, could feel the growing pressure he was under to resolve this, in a way that didn't expose him to further accusations of misconduct. The public spectacle had shifted the balance of power, at least temporarily. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the officer stepped back, still scowling. "Fine," he muttered, though the resentment in his voice was palpable. "You can go, but next time, cooperate when you're asked." Olivia didn't respond to his thinly veiled warning. She simply nodded to the driver, signaling for him to continue driving. Her pulse was still racing, but she maintained her calm demeanor as the car pulled back onto the road. She could feel the gaze of the cameras still on her, the eyes of the world now watching what had nearly become another tragic story. As they drove away, Olivia finally allowed herself to exhale. The confrontation had ended without violence, but the emotional toll weighed heavily on her. She had stood her ground, protected herself from further humiliation or worse. But the experience had left a bitter taste in her mouth. No matter how accomplished she was, no matter how much she had achieved, she could still be reduced in an instant to nothing more than a suspicious figure in the eyes of someone who viewed her skin color as a threat. The drive to the courthouse felt longer than usual, though in reality, it was just a few minutes. Olivia stared out the window, her thoughts racing, the familiar cityscape passing by like a blur. She had fought so hard to be seen for her intellect, her expertise, her accomplishments. But moments like this reminded her that for some, she would always be seen through the lens of prejudice. When she arrived at the courthouse, Ethan was waiting for her at the entrance. He immediately noticed something was off. "Judge Carter, is everything all right?" he asked, concern etching his features. Olivia gave a small nod, though the weight of the incident still clung to her. "I'm fine," she said, though she wasn't entirely sure if that was true. "Just a small delay." Ethan hesitated, clearly sensing more had happened than she was letting on, but he knew better than to press. "The courtroom is ready," he said instead. "Shall we?" She nodded again and followed him inside, her mind still replaying the events of the morning. As she walked through the grand halls of justice, her footsteps echoing off the marble floors, Olivia felt the familiar surge of purpose return to her. Here, at least, she knew she had power. Here she could make a difference. But the reality of what had just happened couldn't be shaken off so easily. Even in her position, she had been treated like an outsider, a threat. The injustice of it gnawed at her, even as she prepared to don her robe and take her seat at the bench. Later that afternoon, after a long and grueling session in court, Olivia found herself in front of the cameras once again, but this time, it was on her own terms. Elena Sanchez had requested an interview, and though Olivia was hesitant at first, she knew that silence would only allow the narrative to be controlled by others. The footage of her encounter with Officer Mitchell had already started circulating online, sparking a heated public debate about racial profiling and police conduct. The interview was held in a small studio set up outside the courthouse. Elena was professional, respectful, and direct, as Olivia expected. They sat facing each other under the bright studio lights, the cameras rolling as the nation tuned in to hear Olivia's account of the day's events. "Judge Carter," Elena began, her voice steady, "thank you for agreeing to speak with us today. I know this must be a difficult time." Olivia nodded slightly, her face composed, but her eyes carrying the weight of the ordeal. "Thank you for having me," she replied. "It's important that these conversations happen, even when they're uncomfortable." Elena didn't waste any time getting to the heart of the matter. "Can you walk us through what happened this morning? The footage has sparked a lot of discussion, but I'd like to hear your perspective." Olivia took a deep breath before speaking. "What happened this morning is something that happens far too often to people of color in this country. I was pulled over for no legitimate reason, treated with suspicion solely because of my appearance. Despite being a judge, despite knowing the law inside and out, I was made to feel like a criminal in a situation where I had done nothing wrong." Elena nodded, encouraging her to continue. "I know that my experience is not unique," Olivia said, her voice growing stronger with each word. "There are countless others who have been in similar situations, many of whom didn't have the privilege of cameras or a public platform to protect them. The reality is that systemic racism exists, and it affects every aspect of our society, including law enforcement." Elena's face was serious, her eyes locked on Olivia as she spoke. "You've been a leading voice in the fight for justice and equality," she said. "How do you think this incident will shape your work moving forward?" Olivia paused for a moment, considering the weight of the question. "I've always believed in the power of the law to bring about change," she said finally. "But today was a reminder that the law alone isn't enough. We need to change the way people think, the way people treat one another. We need to address the biases that exist within our institutions. This incident has only strengthened my resolve to continue fighting for that change." The interview continued, touching on issues of police reform, racial bias, and the broader implications of Olivia's experience. When it was over, Olivia felt a sense of catharsis, but also a deeper realization of the long road ahead. She had used her platform to speak out, but the work was far from over. In the days that followed, public reaction to the footage was swift and divided. Some rallied behind Olivia, praising her for her bravery and speaking out against racial injustice. Others, however, twisted the narrative, accusing her of overreacting, of playing the race card. It was a harsh reminder of how even the most clear-cut cases of injustice could be distorted by those unwilling to acknowledge the truth. But Olivia didn't let the backlash deter her. She knew the importance of staying the course, of continuing to fight for the reforms that were so desperately needed. And while the immediate conflict with Officer Mitchell had ended, the larger battle for justice was only just beginning. As the days turned into weeks, Olivia's experience became a rallying cry for change. She was invited to speak at community events, to meet with activists and lawmakers, all of whom were determined to use this moment as a catalyst for reform. The footage of her encounter had sparked something, a movement that refused to be ignored. At one such event, held in a packed community center filled with people of all ages and backgrounds, Olivia stood at the podium, addressing the crowd with the same strength and conviction she had shown throughout her career. Her words were met with applause, with nods of agreement, with a shared understanding of the long journey still ahead. But what struck Olivia the most was the presence of one man at the back of the room, standing quietly, his face partially obscured by the dim lighting. It was Officer Brian Mitchell. Their eyes met briefly, and though he made no move to approach her, Olivia could sense that something had shifted within him. Perhaps it was the public outcry. Perhaps it was the footage that had forced him to confront his own actions. Or perhaps it was something deeper. Whatever it was, Olivia knew that change, however slow, was possible. As she finished her speech and stepped away from the podium, the crowd erupted in applause. But Olivia's mind was already focused on the future. The immediate conflict might have been resolved, but the fight for justice was far from over, and she was ready to lead it. The air buzzed with anticipation as Olivia stood behind the stage curtain, waiting for her name to be announced. The community center was packed, far more crowded than she had expected. Every seat was taken, and people spilled into the aisles and doorways, eager to hear her speak. The day's event had grown into something much larger than a simple gathering. It had become a focal point for discussions about racial justice and police reform. Since the incident with Officer Brian Mitchell, Olivia had found herself at the center of a national conversation that showed no signs of slowing down. The footage of the encounter, captured by Elena Sanchez's camera crew, had spread like wildfire, sparking debates in newsrooms and homes across the country. Some praised her for her courage and composure, while others tried to diminish her experience, dismissing it as a misunderstanding or accusing her of playing the race card. But Olivia knew better than to let the negative voices get to her. She had faced worse in her life, and if anything, the backlash only deepened her resolve. Behind the stage, Ethan handed her a bottle of water and smiled at her with quiet encouragement. "You're going to be great," he said. Olivia gave him a nod, though her mind was elsewhere. She had been preparing for this speech for days, agonizing over every word, every pause, knowing how important it was to strike the right tone. The people gathered here were looking to her for guidance, for inspiration, and for hope. She could feel the weight of that responsibility. She glanced out from behind the curtain, scanning the crowd. There were students, activists, local leaders, and ordinary citizens, all united by a shared purpose. But what caught her attention was the small group of police officers near the back of the room. They stood stiffly in their uniforms, their expressions unreadable. And among them, standing slightly apart, was Officer Brian Mitchell. Olivia's stomach tightened at the sight of him. She hadn't expected him to come, hadn't even thought he would be interested in hearing what she had to say. After their encounter, she had assumed he would retreat into his own world, perhaps doubling down on his beliefs. But here he was, standing quietly, as if something in him had shifted. Maybe it was curiosity, or perhaps it was the weight of public scrutiny. Whatever the reason, Olivia knew his presence at this event meant something. The MC's voice boomed over the speakers, announcing Olivia's name, and the crowd erupted in applause. The moment had arrived. With a final breath to steady herself, Olivia stepped out from behind the curtain and onto the stage. The applause grew louder as she crossed to the podium, the sound of clapping hands reverberating off the walls. She paused, letting the energy of the room wash over her, grounding herself in the moment. When the applause finally subsided, Olivia leaned into the microphone. "Thank you all for being here today," she began, her voice calm but resonant. It means the world to me to see so many people coming together in the pursuit of justice, equality, and change." She glanced down at her prepared notes but decided in that instant to speak from the heart. The words she had rehearsed felt too polished, too distant from the raw emotions that had been simmering inside her since the incident. She folded the paper and set it aside. "I want to share something personal with you today," she said, her eyes scanning the crowd. "You've all seen the footage. You know what happened to me on that street. But what you don't know is what it felt like. The fear, the anger, the humiliation of being treated like a suspect in my own city. I've spent my entire career working within the law, upholding it, believing in its ability to create fairness and justice for everyone. But in that moment, when I was asked to step out of my car, all of my accomplishments, my hard work, my title, meant nothing. In the eyes of that officer, I was just another black woman who didn't belong." A murmur ran through the audience, and Olivia saw heads nodding in understanding. They knew. Many of them had experienced similar moments, where their identity overshadowed their humanity, where they were reduced to stereotypes and assumptions. "It's easy to feel powerless in situations like that," Olivia continued. "It's easy to let fear and anger consume you. But what I realized in that moment, and what I want to share with you today, is that we do have power. We have the power to demand change, to hold people accountable, and to reshape the systems that perpetuate these injustices." She paused, her gaze sweeping across the room again. Her eyes briefly met Officer Mitchell's, and for a split second, she thought she saw a flicker of something in his expression. Maybe guilt, maybe regret. It was impossible to tell. "But this is not just about one officer or even one incident," Olivia continued. "This is about a system that has been designed to uphold certain values while marginalizing others. It's about how we, as a society, view race, power, and privilege. We cannot let these moments pass without action. We cannot let the status quo remain. Because if we do, we are complicit in the very injustice we seek to dismantle." The crowd was silent now, hanging on her every word. Olivia could feel the collective energy in the room, the sense that something transformative was happening. It wasn't just a speech, it was a call to action. "We need police reform," she said, her voice gaining strength. "We need better training. We need accountability. And we need to rethink the way law enforcement interacts with communities of color. But more than that, we need to change the way we see each other. This isn't just about policies and procedures. It's about empathy. It's about recognizing the humanity in every person, no matter their skin color, no matter where they come from." The applause started slowly at first, then grew into a powerful, thunderous wave of support. Olivia stood at the podium, absorbing the noise, feeling the tide of momentum turning in the right direction. This was why she had come here, not just to share her story, but to help ignite the change that was so desperately needed. As the applause subsided once more, Olivia took a deep breath. "I'm proud to stand before you today as someone who has lived through the challenges we face. But I also know that I'm one of the lucky ones. Many people don't get the chance to tell their story. Many lives are lost before they can even begin. That's why we're here, to honor those voices, to demand justice for them, and to ensure that their stories are not forgotten." Tears welled up in her eyes as she spoke, but she held them back, knowing that this was not the time for her emotions to take center stage. The real work lay ahead, and it would require every bit of strength and determination she possessed. When she finished speaking, the crowd rose to its feet, the standing ovation lasting longer than she could have ever imagined. Olivia stepped back from the podium, feeling the weight of the moment settle over her. The path forward was long, but for the first time in a while, she felt like they were making progress. As she stepped off the stage, she was greeted by a flurry of handshakes, hugs, and words of encouragement. Activists and community leaders thanked her for her leadership, for using her platform to shine a light on the injustices so many faced. But as the crowd began to disperse and Olivia made her way toward the exit, she felt a presence behind her. Turning, she found herself face to face with Officer Brian Mitchell. He stood there awkwardly, his hands in his pockets, his gaze shifting uncomfortably before finally meeting hers. Olivia felt a wave of conflicting emotions, anger, frustration, curiosity, all bubbling up inside her as she faced the man who had caused her so much pain. "Judge Carter," he said quietly, his voice lacking the authoritative edge it had carried that day. I wanted to say I'm sorry for what happened. I was wrong." The words hung in the air between them, and for a moment, Olivia wasn't sure how to respond. She had replayed the events of that day in her mind so many times, and now here he was, standing before her, offering an apology. It felt surreal. "I've been doing a lot of thinking since that day," Officer Mitchell continued, his eyes dropping to the ground. "I saw the footage, I heard the conversations, and I realized that I acted out of bias. I didn't see you for who you are. I saw a stereotype, and for that, I'm truly sorry." Olivia's mind raced as she processed his words. There was a part of her that wanted to accept his apology, to acknowledge that maybe people could change, even those deeply embedded in the very systems she was fighting against. But another part of her, the part that had been bruised and scarred by that encounter, found it hard to let go of the hurt. "Thank you for saying that," Olivia finally replied, her voice measured. "I appreciate it, but an apology isn't enough. We need more than that." Officer Mitchell nodded, his face somber. "I know. I'm committed to making changes, both in myself and in how I do my job. I don't expect forgiveness, but I wanted you to know that I'm trying." Olivia studied him for a moment longer, searching for sincerity in his eyes. What she saw wasn't an instant transformation, but it was a start. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough for now. "Then keep trying," she said, offering him a small but firm nod. "And make sure others do too." With that, she turned and walked away, leaving Officer Mitchell standing in the dimly lit hallway. She didn't look back, but she could feel the shift, however slight, in the air. Change was never easy, but it was possible. And as she left the community center, Olivia knew that the fight for justice was far from over, but it was one she was ready to lead. Not just for herself, but for everyone who needed her to keep going. Weeks passed, and Olivia's story continued to dominate the headlines. Her name became synonymous with the movement for justice, her face a symbol of resilience and determination. As the national conversation grew louder, tangible steps began to take shape. Local governments held hearings on police reform, community leaders organized task forces, and activists pushed for real systemic change. Olivia found herself busier than ever, not only presiding over cases in court, but also attending town halls, leading discussions, and working with lawmakers to draft new legislation aimed at preventing incidents like the one she had experienced. The road was long, and progress was slow, but every small victory felt like a step in the right direction. One day, as she sat in her office, reviewing the latest draft of a police reform bill, she received an unexpected visitor, Elena Sanchez. The journalist had played a crucial role in bringing her story to the public eye, and Olivia hadn't seen her since the interview weeks ago. "Judge Carter," Elena greeted her warmly as she stepped into the office. "I wanted to check in and see how you've been doing." Olivia smiled, motioning for her to take a seat. "I'm doing all right," she replied. "Busy, but I wouldn't have it any other way." Elena nodded, her sharp eyes taking in the stacks of paperwork on Olivia's desk. "I can see that. The work you're doing is making a real difference. People are starting to listen." "I hope so," Olivia said, her tone measured. "But there's still so much more to be done. This fight isn't over." Elena leaned forward, her voice softening. "I know. But what you've started here is important. And I wanted to tell you that I'm working on a follow-up piece about the changes we're seeing. The reforms, the community organizing, all of it. I'd love to get your thoughts on where we go from here." Olivia considered the journalist's words for a moment, then nodded. I'd be happy to. But I want to make sure we focus on the bigger picture. This isn't just about my experience. It's about the people who don't get their stories told, who don't have the privilege of a camera crew to hold the system accountable. Agreed, Elena said. That's exactly what I want to highlight. Your story was a catalyst, but the movement is about all of us. They spoke for a while longer, discussing the next steps, the importance of keeping the momentum going. When Elena finally left, Olivia felt a renewed sense of purpose. The journey had been exhausting, but it was far from over. Later that evening, as Olivia stood by her window, gazing out at the city she had dedicated her life to, she reflected on everything that had happened. The incident with Officer Mitchell, the public outcry, the countless interviews and meetings, it had all been a whirlwind. But through it all, she had remained steadfast in her belief that justice was worth fighting for, no matter how difficult the road ahead. As she sipped her tea, a notification flashed on her phone, a news alert about new reforms being passed in the city council. It was a small victory, but it felt monumental in its own way. Olivia smiled to herself, feeling the weight of hope settling in her chest. She knew there would be setbacks, moments of frustration and fatigue, but she also knew that change was possible, and that her voice, and the voices of so many others, were making a difference. She turned off the light, letting the city's quiet hum lull her into a sense of calm. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new battles to fight. But for now, she allowed herself a moment of peace, knowing that she was ready for whatever came next. The fight was far from over. But Olivia Carter would keep going, not just for herself, but for everyone who needed her to continue leading the way.